Hello and welcome to the 316th episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. My name is Mark, I am the Green Tank, and today's episode is going to be a very special episode in a couple of ways. First of all, this is a two-tank situation, as I am joined by Nealon the Orange Tank.
Hello, it is me, the other tank.
The other tank, yes, the other half of this one, because we are flying without either Christina the Blue Tank or Kellen the Red Tank, so it is a two-tank operation this time. It is further going to be a special episode because Nealon actually thinks this episode is going to be a designer spotlight, because I told him we were going to be doing a designer spotlight. Mm-hmm. But Nealon, I got to tell you, I'm just, I do these deep, exhaustive dives in order to get these designer spotlights done. I'm in the library, I'm doing research, I got my team on it, and, I try to be very thorough, get everything done, and I just could not muster up something to the level of quality that I demand out of a designer spotlight. So I'm making a promise here to our listeners that the next episode will be a full-fledged designer spotlight. I just didn't want to come near with less than grade A stuff. It has been hot in Vegas. It's been sapping my strength. I had my first soccer game this weekend in 95-degree heat, and I'm just burnt out. But we are going to have designer spotlights. The second reason this is a special episode, not only because it is a two-person episode, but also because, as I just mentioned, Nealon doesn't know what the episode is going to be about. Furthermore, I don't know, Nealon, have you ever listened to like a podcast or something and the hosts are sort of coy about what the episode's going to be? Like, it's going to be a surprise, but then sometimes they realize as they're saying that, but the listener who has pulled up the podcast already has read the notes and knows what the podcast is going to be.
Sure, yeah. It's hard to introduce the element of surprise when you have to like title and describe an episode.
Right, exactly. And so the element of surprise, actually, Nealon is the person who titles and describes the episode, so he may try to prolong this, but there's a chance that the listeners, as they brought up the episode, know what the episode is going to be about, but Nealon will not know what the episode is about, because I'm not going to tell him now what it's about, which is probably giving him a little bit of anxiety. Don't worry.
Wait, hang on. So fine. I'm not even going to know until we get to the second half?
That's right. This is not a bit, listeners. Nealon legitimately thought we were going to do the Spanish Spotlight, and now not only are we not doing it, but I'm not going to tell him what we do until we get to it. Not because
very disconcerting.
Yes, not because anything like super incredible. I think it's going to be fun, but I just think it's going to be a little fun to surprise him with it. But the listener may or may not know what it's going to be. So this is a very one-of-a-kind, mold-breaking episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. So
we had to get there 316 episodes later. you
have to reinvent yourself when you've been doing something for a long time. You want to keep things fresh. So what better way to keep things fresh than have my co-host have no idea what's going on and probably give him an unwarranted level of anxiety. So perfect.
But I love this. This is the best. This is the best record we've ever done.
Before we get into it, though, we're going to be talking about the games we've played. I'm going to do a couple of different games. I'm going to be talking about Binho.
Surprise, Mark. You're actually not talking about Binho today. You're talking about Dwellings of Eldervale.
Nealon will, unless he surprises me, tell us about Stamp Swap, and then finally I'll also mention First Rat. So, Nealon, have you ever heard of Binho? Binho or Binho boards?
Nuh-uh.
Okay. So this is a dexterity soccer themed game. Part of me felt like this was a game that might be popular around the world in the same way other dexterity soccer game.
Is this it's called like Subito adjacent?
Yeah. Okay. So Subito or Subuto, whatever it's called, that's pretty popular around the world. Like that's a game that you would have seen in South Africa growing up, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I thought that this was the same sort of thing, like a game that you'd seen anywhere. Though to be honest, while that was my first thought, like I wonder how long this game has been around, I thought it was probably something that had been popular since the 60s, just more like the vibe it gave off. And looking it up, I found out that it was actually designed in 2018 by Nick Witherall, who started just making these boards in his backyard. But it absolutely has the feel of a timeless dexterity game a la Crokinole. So what is Binho? Well, the classic version is a board that mimics a soccer field, complete with artificial grass and all the markings of a field. Instead of 11 players, you have 11 metal poles that you're going to screw into holes in the field, into the board. And then on your turn, it's an exceptionally simple game. All you do is flick a little ball at your opponent's goal. You try to make it past these metal poles and into the goal. First to 7 wins. If you don't score on a flick, wherever the ball ends up is where your opponent flicks from, and you go back and forth until somebody scores 7. And that in itself is absolutely enough. It's like foosball, really simple, but even in that very basic way, totally enough and super, super fun. However, there's a bit more. Soccer wouldn't totally be soccer without yellow and red cards, and you've got that with Binho. So with dexterity games, there's obviously a lot of room for little mistakes. You can accidentally double tap the ball when you flick it, or you can try for a hard shot if the ball's all the way on your side of the field, or even try to float a shot instead of going like weaving through these metal poles. You can try to like flick it over the poles and into your opponent's goal. And in taking these kinds of shots, you might miss and shoot the ball off the table. No big deal, right? Wrong. That's a yellow card in Binho. 2 yellow cards, that's a red card. And what happens on a red card, Neon?
You're off.
That's right. You lose a player. They're sent off. And this part's fun. You flip this special coin that's included in the game, and whoever wins the flip gets to pick the piece that gets unscrewed. So if I commit the red card and Nealon wins the flip, he gets to pick which piece of my players get removed. And if I win the flip, I get to pick which of my players gets removed. And then you just keep playing, 1 player down or 2 players down, or whatever the case may be, flicking the ball back and forth until, again, a player scores 7 and the game's over. I absolutely love this game. And like foosball, you absolutely don't have to be a soccer fan to enjoy it. Probably helps a little bit, but really, really not necessary. It's very foosball-like in that way. Won't be for everyone, but if you like foosball, if you like dexterity games, if you like games that are easy to teach, or you like playing flicking games along the lines of Crokinole, but with that hilarious yellow red card wrinkle, which also you don't need to play with. Like the yellow red card thing is completely optional. Or if you're looking for a really beautiful production that absolutely feels like a centerpiece sort of game in the same way that Crokinole often will, then I'd absolutely recommend taking a look at Binho, which again was designed by Nick Witherall and published by Binho Boards. Super fun dexterity game that just had a blast with.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm instantly like looking at this, wondering if I should get a board for my younger brother, who is a mad soccer fan.
Oh, yeah.
How big is this roughly?
This is maybe 18 inches by 10 inches.
Oh, that's not too bad at all.
Yeah, no, it's not massive. It's definitely not massive. It's smaller than a normal board game board for sure.
Okay.
All right, Nealon, why don't you tell us about Stamp Swap?
Yeah, so Stamp Swap is the latest Stonemaier game. This is designed by Paul Salomon, who I believe is probably most well known for Genotype, a game that I've not yet played, despite owning for a little bit now. But this was sort of like a surprise, quick release from Stonemaier. I only was made aware of this like in the last few weeks, and it's out as of this week. So unusual for them to like have these quick turnarounds. And as you'd expect, this has all of the trappings of a lovely Stonemaier production. The game is about, as the name suggests, swapping stamps. So it kind of cleanly divides in sort of 3 basic mechanics. The first being a drafting phase, where you're going to be collecting these little stamp tiles. The stamps themselves are going to be one of 5 different themes, one of 5 different colors. Each of those themes is going to score for each player depending on the starting board they have. So let's say I'm trying to collect the space stamps. If I get a space stamp in every round, I'm going to be getting a point off of it, of which there are 3 rounds in the game. So if I get one in round 1, I'm going to get 3 points off of a total. If I get one later, I'm going to get less and less points, and so on. In addition, there are these contest cards that are randomized at the start of the game, and these are going to give you scoring opportunities. For example, one of the contest cards might say, pick one of the groups of stamps on your board, which is like a cluster of adjacent stamps. And then however many of a specific color of your choice you have in that group, that's how many points you can get multiplied by, let's say, 2 or 3. Another one might be based on certain shapes of stamps. Other ones might be based on some of these stamps that are just demarcated in the corner like cancelled stamps. But crucially, you're going to choose when you trigger each of these contests. So you might be working towards one of them in round 1, one of them in round 2, and one of them in round 3. And you can't repeat the same one twice. So you're going to sort of be staggering your goals based on when you're planning on targeting and hitting those big scoring opportunities. And that's kind of a very simple setup, but the twist on this is that it's not just about drafting stamps and placing them. After you've drafted your collection of stamps, you then get into this I split you choose phase, where you're going to take each of your stamps, you're going to choose one to reserve, take the rest and put them into 2 piles, and then in order around the table, everyone's going to choose one of another player's piles to take. So you take that pile, they get the other pile. You keep doing this until everyone has taken a pile and kept a pile, effectively. Collect all those stamps together, put them onto your board, and then go through the rigmarole of scoring them. There's one final contest at the end, which is like a really big scoring objective that everyone else is working to. And then finally, every stamp is worth a handful of points. There are these forever stamps that are kind of whoever has the most of them is going to get a bunch of points. So it's kind of standard scoring beyond that. So it's a very simple premise. It is a breezy game. 3 rounds means that you're kind of in and out in 45 minutes. And like I said, the production on this is lovely. Like the thought of being the graphic designer that had to come up with so many different stamps across all these themes, like, like I said, animal stamps, space stamps, monument stamps. They're all beautiful. They're all lovely. They're on these thick, lavish cardboard. Some of them are foily stamps, which are like super rare ones that are worth a lot of points. Stonemaier just kind of always gets this side of the game right. The problem is they always tend to get the other side of the game wrong, in my opinion, which is to say that the scoring balance in this seems off a lot of the time. The disparity between scores I see in any typical game, whether it's from one game to the next or between players, is so wild just based on your specific ability to capitalize on scoring opportunities. Not all of the scoring opportunities are also created very equally. The thing I described about getting points for stamps in round 1 versus round 2 versus round 3, that is all minuscule versus just your biggest scoring opportunities at the end of the game and in the third round. Like, they dwarf anything that happens in the first couple of rounds. The spatial puzzle component of this also just feels a little bit underbaked because it's not really a polyomino game, right? These are all just like square and rectangle stamps. There are contests that would benefit from their adjacency and how they're arranged in your board, but like sometimes the combination of contests either kind of negates some of the fun spatial puzzles. I literally had one game of this where, because of the combination of contest cards, it was trivially obvious how to place all your stamps, just like a ring around the edge of the board, because nothing was conflicting with that. And that's kind of the bummer. Is like I kind of wish that these contests were sort of more curated to like be presented in interesting combinations, because what happens a lot of the time, it just kind of feels like there are some that are just not worth pursuing, some that are clearly not as score beneficial as others, and it kind of ends up neutering the competitive side of the game. So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to be like too critical about this. It's a very cute, very light game. Don't expect it to be intensely competitive in the sense of people really getting too strung out about their scores, because it just feels, a lot of it sometimes feels quite arbitrary. Have you looked at pictures of this, Mark?
Yeah, I had not heard of this game before you started talking about it, and I'm looking at it now. And as you said, the production is lovely. It has a very like pastel-y, but colorful pastel-y sort of palette that I think is very, very nice and inviting for sure. When you were saying that the scoring disparities were pretty big, I actually initially got excited because we have this thing with a lot of Euros where no matter what path you go on, everybody's going to end up being a couple points away from each other, and that always feels like, did I even do anything? And so a game that allows you to have like big score differences initially intrigues me. But as you said, it seems like that disparity is a little bit random. The way you're describing it reminds me a little bit of Tapestry and the issue I had with Tapestry, where I think there have been revisions, so maybe this is no longer holds, but in those first games of Tapestry, I just felt like it came down so much to the nation you were dealt, I forget what the civilization you were dealt, and some randomness that I felt was the reason, because that game you can have wild score differences as well. So that part is weird. Also, I guess with Tapestry, I don't remember the details of that game so much anymore now, but I also remember that game feeling like the spatial aspect of the building felt a little bit tacked on. It feels even, I mean, again, I'm just based on your cursory explanation of the rules, it feels even more tacked on here. Like I'm looking at the player boards, and they have these grids that you're placing your stamps on, and as you're sort of describing it, it almost feels like, by the way you're describing it, pretty superfluous, right? Like there's not.
I wouldn't say entirely. Like it does depend on the scoring cards you have, because one of the ones, some of them have stamps that are surrounded, have stamps that are touching the edge of the board, have stamps that are arranged in groups like these adjacent clusters. So there is occasionally this consideration of like, if I create 5 distinct clusters of stamps, then that satisfies one of the goals, but it sort of hurts the other one. But those opportunities felt kind of rare to me. And I think I would say that it felt, in the cases where there were interactions, they weren't very interesting. They kind of felt easy to solve. Okay, how to optimize your build.
Right.
Your grid also just kind of felt altogether too big. So it just never felt you were constrained by the spatial puzzle of it at all. And again, that's like probably not what they're going for. Like they're not trying to make a Calico where you're just going to be like agonizing over every single placement. They're trying to make something more accessible, I'm sure. But it ends up just feeling very neutered by comparison. And also in some ways surprising, because like I agree with you that I think a game where the score differential can be big is very rare these days and is an interesting thing. But not when it feels like, okay, this person is like 100 points ahead of me, and unless I'd done the exact same thing they did, then I would never have even been capable of achieving that score, you know?
Right.
It's like there is one best way to solve each of the specific combinations of cards, and then honing in on that is going to be the path to victory by like miles and miles and miles.
How much could these issues be solved by, like, I assume the scoring cards are sort of randomized at the beginning of the game?
Yes.
So could you curate the cards to make it, because everybody's working off the same scoring cards, right? It's not like anybody has. Could you like pick out specific scoring cards you think and make the game as, you know, tense or as competitive or as, you know, idealized as possible? Do you think there's a way to do that? Or
yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, I think that's asking players to do too much, to be honest. But like, I agree. Yeah, I think that would be the way to do it, is to like find groups of cards that work together. There's a reason that like even in games like Quacks of Quedlinburg, you have very specific combinations that are recommended of these things. Like you want there to be synergies between the scorings, for example, the way that each of these things operates. And this just kind of negates that entirely. This kind of does away with that entirely, and I think to its detriment. It feels like it's just too Wild Westy as a result.
Right. Well, at least there's potentially a way to tighten that up if you want to go to, you know, through the trouble of trying to figure out what the best combos are. Again, not as the game was intended, and that always feels bad to me to like sort of house rule things, but maybe that's a potential way to get around it. Who knows?
For sure. I also don't want to sort of harp too much on the negatives. Like I think for the audience it's targeting, this is going to do gangbusters in the way that like the Stonemaier game is pinpoint accuracy targeted to. Like, it's good enough and it's beautiful, and, you know, for a lot of people that will be enough. Just, I was expecting something more, I guess.
Yeah.
But that is Stamp Swap by Stonemaier Games.
I got a chance to play First Rat, which was designed by Virginio Gili and Gabriele Ausiello and published by Pegasus Spiel. This appears to be the first big published design by Ausiello, but Gili, one of the quote-unquote Italian designers, has a number of titles under his belt, including Grand Austria Hotel, Lorenzo il Magnifico, Coimbra, and Golem, which I reviewed back on episode 311. Mentioning Gili's design background is, I think, both helpful and a little deceptive in the case of First Rat. It's helpful because First Rat is, without a doubt, a completely solidly built game, that's clear. It's deceptive because it is, by some measure, I would say, the lightest of the collection of games I just cited, but a little more about that later. First, let's get into First Rat itself. I generally don't really spend too much time, I don't think, on the theme or setting of games I review, but it seems pretty crucial in talking about First Rat. The idea is you're one of several families of rats who, in scavenging around for their next meal, have come across remnants of comic books describing a moon made out of cheese, and now you're all looking to be the first rat family to build a rocket and become ratronauts. That is a word that I will use only one time in this review, I promise. And again, become the first rat on the moon, hence the title. Now, if you ask me, that's a pretty charming story, and it works perfectly for what I think is a pretty charming game. The cutesy story is brought to life by cartoony, cutesy artwork by Dennis Lohausen, which is pretty adorable. To further that cutesy feeling, a way to describe what the board looks like is to think of Candyland. It's got a path that leads from the bottom all the way to the top to the moon space. The spaces also each have a resources printed on them that you'll pick up when you move your rat pawns onto them, and the spaces come in one of 5 different colors, so even more Candylandy in that way. On your turn, you're either going to move one of your rat pawns, you start with 2 on the board, one of your rat pawns up to 5 spaces, or move as many rats as you have, because you can get more than the initial 2, up to 3 spaces, provided each of them lands on a space of the same color. So I can move one rat up to 5 spaces with no restriction, or if I have, say, 3 rats on the board, I can move them all up to 3 spaces as long as they all land on the same color. Furthermore, if you land on a space with an opponent, you're going to have to pay them a piece of cheese, which, unsurprisingly, is the currency of the game. When you finish moving, as I mentioned, you're going to pick up the resource that you land on. Most of these resources are going to be pieces to the rocket ship that your rats are trying to build. They come in cute forms of vinegar, baking soda, together. You put those together, you get the propulsion for the ship, obviously. Tin cans of peas, which are the structure of the ship. And calculators, which are the computers of the ship. So all very cute. These are, again, resources you'll be collecting. At the end of any of your turns, after you've moved your rats and got your resource, you can trade in specific amounts of these resources in a recipe fulfillment manner to build parts of the ship. So, for example, on your turn, after you've picked up your resources, you can trade in lots of 2 baking sodas and 5 vinegars to build part of the thruster. When you do, you turn those resources in and you put one of your scoring markers in the thruster section. You're going to want to build the sections early because the first person to build a section gets more points. So after I build a thruster, Nealon on his turn can build part of the thruster and put his scoring marker in the thruster scoring section, but whoever got there first will be scoring more points. In addition to those 4 rocket building resources that I mentioned, you can get apple cores. That's another resource. Each apple core counts as a point of movement you can use on the side track on the board where you can scurry around these little mini rat meeples that you have. If you get enough movement points, you can get comics, which are going to give you passive abilities. You can unlock more of the, again, as I mentioned, full-size rat pawns. This is how you go from 2 to up to 4 rat pawns that you can place on the main section of the board. Or you can move these little mini rats using the apple cores to score in this other section of the board, which involves you placing your scoring tile in this other section. Again, first person to get there gets the most points. So another place to use your scoring tokens. Finally, and this is a little difficult to explain, the last resource you can pick up are these light bulbs that allow you to move your light bulb marker up a track that moves along the main Candyland path that your rats are going to be traveling. So it's sort of like this light bulb tracker that moves alongside the main path. You want to do this because any rat that ends their turn on a space behind wherever your light bulb currently is gets a +1 to whatever resource they're picking up. So if you have a rat that ends on a vinegar spot and they happen to be behind wherever your light bulb marker is, instead of getting 1 vinegar or 2 vinegar, you'll get +1. So that's another aspect of the game. In addition to picking up those resources, there are places to buy upgrades. There are backpacks that are going to give you more yield in the same sort of way as the light bulb does whenever you pick something up. So if you get a +2 cheese backpack, for example, whenever you land on a cheese spot, you're going to get 2 more. And so on. There's a spot where you can buy these energy drinks that allow you to one-time double the resources you get on your turn. And finally, there's a place where you can buy these bottle caps, which is like a way of earning points at the end of the game in a special scoring just for you. Speaking of the end game, there are 2 ways the game ends. One is if you get all 4 of your rats all the way up to the top of the track and thereby to the moon. You get them all up to the top. That ends the game. You also get points for being the first person to get your rats up there. So this is another race aspect of the game. Or you can end the game by placing all 8 of your scoring markers out on the, again, various recipe fulfillment tracks on the board that I mentioned earlier. So that's how the game works. Recommending First Rat is interesting. I feel like I can give it an unquestioned endorsement that is also paradoxically filled with caveats. So don't go into First Rat seeing Gilly's name as a designer and wanting a big clockwork in-depth game. First Rat is quite straightforward. Conversely, I've also heard First Rat described as a gateway game, and I think that's right, but I'd also throw a bit of caution out there for that as well. I think as board gamers, we tend to underestimate how complicated games are for those who aren't regulars in our hobby, and I'm a little worried that this might overwhelm like a non-hobbyist family. But it also might be absolutely perfect for a group that, has a game night every week where they play Catan or Ticket to Ride or something like that, and they're looking for something else. This might be like a perfect game for that. Which is not to say that I don't think this offers something to hardcore gamers, hobbyist gamers as well. I think this definitely can. There are a lot of choices you're going to need to make, and there are potentially, depending on which bonuses are available, a lot of combinations to exploit depending on how the bonuses have randomly come out for a game. This is in fact almost like a negative for me because I feel like people who can hone in on especially strong combos of bonuses and hammer it well enough might be almost impossible to catch up. If somebody really has a nice combo, it can almost feel overwhelming. And the fact that this game is relatively short mitigates that a little bit. But in a couple of games I've played, I felt like, wow, this person really found something and now they're just flying ahead. I think this also is a game served best at higher player counts. I think it goes up to 5. I've only played it at 2, 3, and 4. 2 seems a little bit too open. The threat of having to pay others cheese to share spots wasn't really a big factor. While at 4, it felt a lot tighter and more fun. Although, again, this is in my cutthroat style. It felt a lot more fun that it was tougher to get around and having to pay off players' cheese. I think if you wanted a less confrontational game to play one-on-one with your partner, that two-player, less confrontational, less, stabby way to play might be perfect. And again, while I think this is a game that's probably, I would say, a 7 for me rating it, and I don't think I'm necessarily be dying to break it out too often, it's certainly, again, relatively quick, and quick enough that I can certainly see myself playing it to wind up to get ready a game night, or to wind down a game night after everybody's ready to go. And I can certainly see it as being a staple, as I mentioned earlier, for a family game night to take the place of something like a Tickets Rider or Monopoly or something like that. So yeah, I mean, a recommendation, just know that it's a game that feels like Swiss Army to me, in a way that, it can fit in a lot of ways, but also is sort of deceptive in the way it looks. It can look on some level like you see the designer name and it looks like it might be a more complicated game than it is. But then you look at the board and you look at, again, the Candyland feeling, and it might look a little simpler than what it is. So just a game that fits a lot of potential gaps in a collection, but also is sort of hard to pin down. So anyway, that is First Rat by Virginio Gili and Gabriele Ausiello, and published by Pegasus Spiele.
I know that this was fairly popular with Shut Up and Sit Down at some point. They had been recommending it, and I always keep forgetting that this is a Healy game, actually, because that I keep feeling, I mean, despite your caveats, I feel like that's a game I should at least look into. But yeah. I also kind of feel that I wish more games like this existed, which is to say solid 60-minute midweight games that are not just fillery,
Yeah. Yeah, again, it feels like when you say not fillery, I wonder. Yeah, I would say it's not fillery. Again, it's on all these borders. It feels like, is it too light? Is it too heavy? Is it fillery? Is it a full-fledged game? It's both a strength and a weakness of the game. Again, it fits a lot of things. If people want it to be something, it can be, but it's also hard to pin down. I think that's valid. And again, it's quick, and it's, again, the Gili thing, while not an indication of what you might think the weight of it is a good indication of how, well designed it is. So yeah, I definitely recommend. I think you'd like it for sure.
Cool.
Before we move on, just another reminder that a way to help the show is by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find the show. I guess now you can leave reviews on Pocket Cast, which is a podcast app that I've actually been using for years now that I really enjoy. So that's another way to do it. So let's read a review. This comes to us from Edsmorg via Apple Podcast. Great podcast, great community. There are two great things among many that make BGB stand out: the mix of hosts and the community they've created. All three, sometimes four if we're lucky. I agree. Hosts have different tastes in games, but aren't exclusive in their taste. This leads to really good, thoughtful discussions about the games they review and makes the main topics they have each episode engaging. Not to mention, each episode I find myself laughing to myself at their quips and good-natured ribbing of each other as I walk my dog. Love that. Their own personal friendships really shine through. As far as the second thing, the community around this podcast is wonderful. I would agree. It's full of welcoming people from all over the world, and I've been lucky to regularly meet up with local BGBers for games. Oh, that's great. Again, if you're looking to do that, this is aside from me real quick, you can go to boardgamebarrage.com/map to look for BGBers in your area, potentially looking for games. Back to the review. What more could you ask for from a podcast about board games? So thank you so much, Edsmorg. We were fortunate enough to get a couple more reviews, but I'm not going to read them in full, but I do want to read this one. This comes from Jeremy, the listener. Jeremy, thank you so much for the review. This may sound like a shot at you. I do not mean it, but the review is Top 3. That's the title of the review. Love listening to this podcast. It was hard to get into at first. Okay, maybe that's where it comes from. It was hard to get into at first, but now it's definitely in my top 3. So top 3, you might think that this is a 5-star review. It is a 4-star review. So Jeremy is really tough.
Harsh critic.
Harsh critic. I guess you need to be at least top 2. Maybe it's only the number 1 that gets a 5-star. But kidding aside, thank you so much, Jeremy, for the review. And again, if you want to help out the show, you can do that by leaving a review at Apple Podcasts or Pocket Cast, or wherever you find the show. That means a lot to us and helps grow the show. Thank you so much.
Also worth saying, because it was called out in that review, our community primarily gathers on Discord. So if you want to chat to the people, the fine folks in our community, then what is, in my opinion, the greatest internet community I've ever been a part of, you can go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord.
Yeah, I cannot stress that strongly enough. If this is your first time listening to Board Game Barrage podcast, which would strike me as weird, but if it is, and you take nothing away from it, and if you never listen to another episode, go to the Board Game Barrage Discord, boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, as Neelan said, because that community is amazing and it has completely outshone us, to be frank. Is like, like as great as I feel about the show and as important as the show means to me, like the community that we've been a part of and is primarily in the Discord community is amazing. And I know Discord can be a little like, overwhelming for people who are not familiar with it. It's just a glorified chat room, really, and there are people there talking about board games and other stuff, books and sports and all this other stuff all day long, and they're super, super nice. I cannot believe how wonderful a community we've managed to be a part of, and it's just amazing. So I would definitely recommend, if you take nothing else from this episode, go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord and join that group. They're wonderful people. And now for the main topic. So, again, this is going to be a surprise to Neelan, but this is a nod to another podcast that I mentioned in our bonus episodes that I listen to. This is a podcast called The Big Picture. And what they are is a podcast that covers movies. They're one of my favorites. And what they have is they have a recurring topic called the Mount Rushmore. Okay? And so Neelan, a new American citizen, is, I'm sure, well acquainted with Mount Rushmore. And the idea of a Mount Rushmore of things is something I think has popped up in pulp culture quite a bit. But the idea of what they do is they pick a director and they pick the 4 movies of the director that represents their Mount Rushmore. And so I want to do Mount Rushmore of a couple of different board game designers. Okay. Now, the way that I think many times when people talk about the Mount Rushmore of something, they just pick the 4 best, right?
Sure, but I mean, I imagine the intent is more like 4 ultra-representative, culturally important games. Is that the idea?
Right. That's the idea, but I'm going to do a step further. And the Big Picture podcast, they also sort of do this, I think, most of the time. So I want 4 games for the designers that we talk about that represents not necessarily their greatest games, but the 4 that sort of coincide with the 4 presidents that are on Mount Rushmore. Okay,
oh, that's going to be really rough.
Okay, well, let's not get negative from the start. So,
tell me what you would consider to be the defining
this is what I'm doing.
Traits of Teddy Roosevelt.
This is what we're doing right now. We're about to do this. We're about to do this right now. Believe me, I'm prepared for this. I may not have prepared the designer spotlight to my liking, but I am prepared for this. So, listeners to the show probably know that I'm a little bit of a history buff. People who listen to our bonus episodes on Patreon surely know that I'm a history buff. So, a little bit of history on Mount Rushmore, okay? So Mount Rushmore was designed by this guy named Gottson Borglum, okay? Super funny name. But he selected the 4 presidents there for a specific reason. So I'm going to read just a real quick thing about what each president meant to him when he picked them out, okay? So Washington led the colonists in the American Revolutionary War to win the independence from Great Britain. He was the father of the new country and laid the foundation for American democracy. Because of his importance, Borglum chose Washington to be the most prominent figure on the mountain and represent the birth of the United States. So he represents the beginning, okay, like the birth, okay? Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country. He picked Jefferson to represent growth. Okay, so we have Washington being the first, being like the one that puts the designer out in the world. Not necessarily the first game, but the one I think that like marks them as a great designer. Jefferson is like the growth, so now like this is the designer becoming like a bigger name. Next, we have Roosevelt. Roosevelt provided leadership when America experienced rapid economic growth as it entered the 20th century. Borglum chose Roosevelt to represent the development of the United States. So Roosevelt is the person whose United States is now a growing nation. He's like developing it. So maybe this is like a game that represents a big step forward in the designer's games, or maybe a shifting. This is all like up for interpretation, and designer by designer we can change, but it's generally. And then Lincoln. Lincoln, held the nation during its greatest trial, the Civil War. So Borglum chose Lincoln to represent the preservation of the United States. So this one's a tougher one, but so we've got Washington as the birth, we've got Jefferson as growth, Roosevelt as development, and Lincoln as preservation. So Lincoln can be like, preservation I think is sort of the hardest one to describe, but maybe it's the one that cements the designer as a great designer.
I can kind of imagine what that would be like in the context of a designer, a one that's like still continues to be relevant despite being maybe an older game, for example, right? Something that's
right.
There's the reason we still talk about him.
Yes, exactly. So let's pick a designer, and we'll pick a designer that we have done a designer spotlight of. And of course, we need to pick a designer with a relatively big selection of games. So let's go with, I think the first designer spotlight we ever did was Uwe Rosenberg. Okay, so Neil, if you want to pull up the Uwe Rosenberg page, and it has a bridge list of notable games. See that? Okay, so Neil has pulled up this list that I'm working from of Uwe's notable games, his most notable games. So it starts with 97 Bohnanza. We've got Bargain Hunter 98. We've got Agricola, of course, in 2007. Gates of Liang. We've got all of his big ones here. So let's start with the Washington. What is the Washington? The one that sort of like puts him on the map.
So I think there are two obvious choices here. It's tough because to me it's Agricola, but then I think it's hard to deny that Bohnanza 10 years earlier is the beginning of Uwe craze.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not going to be able to do a Uwe Mount Rushmore without mentioning Agricola.
Oh yeah,
for sure.
Agricola
Like,
will show up
it has to be there.
One spot, one or the other.
Yeah, but I think you can say, because Bohnanza, if I understand correctly, is like a game that is like sold everywhere in maybe Germany especially, but maybe in other parts of Europe that are more, have hobbyist games more in the culture. And I still think Bohnanza is a fantastic game, and it's a game that certainly has stood the test of time. There are certainly people playing Bohnanza, every day. So I would argue that Bohnanza should be the first game, the Washington
game.
Yeah, the game that sets him.
I think that's probably fair, because I actually. Yes, because as I think about it more, I feel like Agricola is much better situated for one of the other heads.
Yeah. So what are we going to have for the Jeffersons, for the Grow? So I think this is the one that sort of establishes them as a designer, maybe a prolific designer or something. So maybe this is the Agricola?
Yeah, it's kind of hard. It's hard not to think of Agricola as this. It's like, because to me, like, that's what cements him as a household name.
Yeah, it's the one that, like, again, Bohnanza, it could be argued, is the one that like puts him on the map, like, oh, this is a real designer, like a big designer. And then you have Agricola, and that's like, boom, this is like now he is like big, right. Obviously one of the games that was a number one game on BGG, so certainly an influential game in board gaming history for sure.
Yep.
Okay, so now we have the Roosevelt, so the development.
Okay, I have a proposal for this.
Yeah, okay.
Which is that, like, there are two things I associate with Uwe Rosenberg, and that is agricultural farming games and polyominoes. Sure. And the polyominoes don't really show up until Patchwork.
Okay.
Which to me represents the beginning of, like, a new direction for Uwe.
A change. Okay.
To become quite progressive.
Yeah. I think that works because we're doing this president by president or game by game. But you also, as we're talking, obviously, I'm like, okay, what are the 4 games going to be, And Agricola obviously has to be one of the games. I think given we want to do a first game, Bohnanza has to be there. Mm-hmm. And then the other 2 are sort of up in the air. But I think, are we going to land on Patchwork and then Feast for Odin?
I think.
You think?
I mean, there will be words if a Feast for Odin does not.
Okay. I think if we're talking about the 4th game, the 4th head being the one that is like preservation, like yes, he had hits before, but like this is unquestionably one of the great designers. I think that game that makes him like a unquestionable Hall of Fame designer is Feast for Odin. Like,
yeah, I think that's exactly it. I also think that, like, even based on what I was saying, where it's like you have the Agricola point, which cements him, right? Like, that's now his staple. That's what everyone now knows Uwe as: pastoral, charming agricultural games. Then you have the Patchwork, which represents a new direction, and Feast for Odin is kind of like the legacy of both of these things, of merging together and like sort of becoming something that's kind of a little bit more. I think of Feast for Odin as his magnum opus personally, so like it's hard for me to like escape that as his preservation game.
Yeah, and I think we don't want to necessarily have this like chronologically fit like the presidents chronologically.
No, totally. But I think it just worked out that way in this case, for sure.
Yeah. Because I think you might argue that Feast for Odin is like the magnum opus, but I think the one, if we're talking about like the growth game, the game that made him not just a designer, but like one of the designers, I think Agricola is unquestionably the one for him that represents that. Okay, so that was easy. Nice and easy. Uwe Rosenberg, Mount Rushmore. All right, for the next designer, let's go with another person who's been on Designer Spotlight, Friedman Friese. We have got a lot of games in German here that I know that they have English translations, but the first one is Funkenschlag, which I think is the progenitor to Power Grid. But we've got Fearsome Floors, we got Power Grid, we've got Fauna, Friday, 504, Fable of Fruits, Fast Sloths, Fayum, Findorf. So a smaller collection here. So this might be a little bit on the tougher side. So what is the Washington game? What puts them on the map?
I think it's Power Grid, right?
Is it Power Grid? Okay, because if we say Power Grid is going to be the one that puts them on the map, then I think it's going to be hard to fill out the other spots. I think we might even do Fearsome Floors for that, but let's go Power Grid because I think that's probably the most obvious pick. So what is the game?
Like tentatively, because to me,
yeah,
Power Grid is also so subject to like perspective, but like mine,
sure.
To me, that was when I was first aware of Frieza was Power Grid.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's probably the pick. It's probably the pick, and again, it's unquestionably has to be on there. Okay, so what is the one that makes him like not only a designer but a big designer? You know what? I'm going to argue. I think it's Friday. Which is weird because. Well, I don't know. I remember Friday being like the solo game for a while. Maybe that's not what I mean. Do you have something else pop?
No, I am. Yeah, now that I'm looking at it, I'm now struggling to see that there's. It's funny because I'm inclined to say that Power Grid is like the right pick for this slot, which
sure
is maybe what you were getting at earlier.
Yeah, and so. And maybe that's the call. Maybe Fearsome. Have you ever played Fearsome Floors?
I have played Fearsome Floors
because he has, I guess, two other notable games. Again, that Funkenschlag game, which is I think again a progenitor to Power Grid, and this other one, Fischi Flupen Frinkendallet. I don't know what this one is. According to the BGG subtitle here, all about buying, selling, and trading of commodities to obtain 3 fetishes first. So probably not one that would have put him on the map. But I think Fearsome Floors is a game that, while like not necessarily heralded very highly, I think it's a solid game that you can look at and be like, okay, this is maybe clearly a designer's first game or one of his first games, but a solid game. So maybe we hit Fearsome Floors as the game that like announced him as a legit real designer or as a legit strong designer, and then Power Grid, because I think Power Grid is sort of akin to his Agricola, right? It's like the one that sort of blew up.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, and now we have the Roosevelt game, which is the development, where he showed he could do other stuff. I think with Frieza, you have a lot of choices here.
Yeah. The thing that comes to mind with me here are the fast-forward games. Even though none of them is, like, spectacular, they kind of represented a pretty novel offshoot for him.
Okay, I'm going to argue something else here. I'm going to argue this is the game that when it came out, I was like, oh my god, this is crazy. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Is it going to be Fauna?
No, it's going to be 504.
Oh, 504?
Although it was like a flop compared to like how much hype I was feeling, at least.
Yeah.
I think the world was sort of feeling about it. But it was like, to me, it was like, this guy is thinking like really outside the box. Like his games are known as like always being weird and fresh and feeling different. But I just remember the audacity of 504 really struck me.
It's a game that I wanted to be good.
Yeah. But does the fact that it's not been as highly esteemed as we sort of hope for, is that enough to take it down? Maybe it is. Maybe. I
do think that there is just something so novel and meta about it as a concept that it would be pretty cool to have in this slot.
Well, okay, let's tentatively put that on. And then the game that, again, the one that the preservation, the one that solidifies him, the Lincoln game. What would you consider like the game that unquestionably this guy is one of the big ones? Is it the Fast Forward series? Is it part of that?
Maybe. I don't know about that. The problem with the Fast Forward series is that neither of them, I don't think any of them is like an amazing game.
Yeah.
If I were to pick my super biased answer, like Fast Sloths is the only Frieza game I have in my collection, but
yeah,
if that's reason enough.
The problem, I think Fast Loss is great. The problem is it hasn't gotten distribution in the U.S. So, this is obviously a U.S.-centric sort of viewpoint. So I take it with a grain of salt. But I think it's sort of hard to get your hands on, and maybe it hasn't really hit. Maybe Fauna?
Wait, what about Fresh Fish?
Fresh Fish. Well, I can't believe we missed Fresh Fish.
Yeah, I guess it's not on this list. But yeah, that would be a great pick.
So where does Fresh Fish
Fresh Fish,
here?
I think, is the preservation game. Because that to me, it feels timeless, and a game that, despite me not having heard about it near its release, just kind of blew me away with how good it was.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so we've got, for the first one, we have Fearsome Floors. We have Power Grid for his establishing the Jefferson. We have the preservation game for sure is going to be Fresh Fish. What is the one that is the innovating game, the one that's the pivoting game?
I think 504. I think it could be 504.
Okay.
I think that makes the most sense.
Yeah, it's just whenever I think of Frieza, for whatever reason, it's weird because, whenever you think of a game designer, you normally think of the 4 best games, the 4 most influential, and maybe 504. 504 certainly is not one of his best games.
No.
You can argue that it's, how influential it is, but for whatever reason, I just think his games are always like, again, fresh and audacious, stuff like that. And that was like crazy audacious to me. So, okay, so we've got his Mount Rushmore. So let's do one more. Let's go with the big one. Let's go with Knizia.
Okay.
Let me pull up the list. Have you got the list up? The abridged list of games? Okay. All right. So obviously, before we can do this, we have to read off every game that he's designed. So sit back. This is going to be a 30-minute list. No. So Neil and I have the list of notable games in front of us. What are we going to pick for his Washington, for his announcement that we've got a designer here?
So I have a suggestion. Well, not even a suggestion, but a proposal. What if we not worked backwards? But I think the preservation game for Knizia is the most interesting one to think about.
Is the crux. Okay.
Yeah. And to me, that feels like Ra.
Interesting. So by the time Ra comes out, he's like, you know what? It's hard to argue. Even though it came out in 1999, he's so prolific and so important to the hobby that I think you're probably right.
Let's it's continued to, even in 2023 with the re-release, it's continued to cement him as a designer that is immensely important to the hobby.
Okay, let's at least pencil it in. I think it's probably the right pick, but let's say Ra. Okay, so then what are we going to do? I think we can get first game out of the way. I think we can do the Washington one. So early designs, we've got Medici 95, High Society 95. We've got Tigris in 97. Modern, and then we got Modern Art in 92.
Yeah, I think if we go past Tigris and Euphrates, that we've made a mistake. So it's something 97 or earlier.
Is it? I think it's got to be Tigris, right?
I think it's got to be. Yeah, I think it has to be. Like, it pains me not to have Modern Art, but because as is literally his like earliest notable game here. But I mean, he just has so much stuff that it not being Tigris would be weird to me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think obviously there is the feeling that with the first game, you have to go, and Modern Art is such a great game that it almost feels like a perfect fit to go Modern Art as his first game. But with a designer so prolific, I think you have to represent Tigris on the list for sure. For sure. And I think even though his Tigris is like more than just an announcement, it is maybe for him an announcement that not only am I a game designer, but I'm already a fantastic game designer. So I think Tigris has to be up there. Okay, so we have Tigris as the progenitor, the first one, although again not necessarily the first one, and we've got Ra as the one that cements him. What do we have as the growth one, the one that shows like sort of that he's going to be prolific, or the one that raises them up there? I mean, I guess there's an argument to be made for the Tigris goes here, but I think that you've got other choices as well.
Yeah, I mean, stuff that's jumping out at me is Lost Cities.
Yeah. What about, this is sort of maybe an odd choice, but what about something like Yellow and Yangtze? The idea that
feels late.
It certainly is late. It is late, but does it maybe represent? And I'm thinking about growth maybe in a way that we don't intend, but like sort of a look back at his designs and refine them, because he had that whole period of refining games, and releasing them with things shaved off. I mean, it maybe is a hard sell, but you've got Blue Lagoon. It could even be Blue Lagoon if we want to go that route. The Blue Lagoon being an offshoot of Through the Desert. But maybe you're right. Maybe that's a step too far. You were saying Lost Cities.
I mean, but only because it's like slightly earlier in his career. But I get that that's also not the intent, is to like obviously have these be strictly chronological. So then the other one that kind of jumps out to me is, I don't know why specifically, but Quest for El Dorado.
So I'm going to make the argument that Quest for El Dorado, even though it's one of my least favorite Knizia games, should be the pivot game.
Okay.
It's the game where like he reimagines deck building with the Knizia thing, and I feel like that was a fundamental game in his library, because he's a very iterative designer as it is, but it just felt like when he took deck building and this race aspect and the Knizia side to it and added that all up, it just felt like him pivoting. Again, I'm sure he's pivoted a bunch of times, but it seemed like a big pivot to me.
My City had also jumped out to me as a pivot game, potentially, just as like a reinvention of what that point is like a flagging legacy format.
Yeah, what do you think is a bigger pivot? Let's say what game, maybe like in terms of quality, you think needs to be up there? If we have Tigris, which has to be up there, and if we have Ra, which has to be up there, what other games in a quality level do you think like maybe we should find a way in there for them? Like,
it's so hard because I think, like with 4 picks only, then it feels criminal to exclude Blue Lagoon, which is a game that we both love, but again, not the intention to only pick games we like.
Yeah.
Blue Lagoon,
I feel like hit pretty hard, but also I feel like didn't really... Not to say that it hasn't stood the test of time, but I feel like I don't hear that many people continuing to talk about Blue Lagoon as highly as we do.
Yeah. What about, it feels like, again, now we're maybe skewing a little bit too much on the older games, but, Through the Desert feels like a timeless game that should be up there. But is it it's certainly not the pivot game. And is it the growth game?
Okay. So here's a complete out of left field pivot suggestion.
Love it.
Ingenious.
Go for it. Oh, okay. Okay.
As like sort of very
down,
mostly abstract with a very novel team mechanic.
Sort of feels
like a timeless classic. I would never guess in a million years that was a Knizia game if you just showed it to me.
Yeah, I like that. I think that does work both on a specific to the president level, like specific to the assignment level, but also in a top 4 timeless games level. So I like that. Okay. So that is the pivot game. What is the growth game?
Man.
It's so hard with Knizia.
Yeah.
I guess it can come down to like a quality pick here.
I think I could see so to me, like one of the things that represents growth to me is accessibility, right? More people discovering his games.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, I keep coming back to Lost Cities as a game that I see so many people playing, regardless of like how deep in the hobby they are. Like that's a game I see people just playing at lunch at work, even when they're not like really hardcore board gamers.
Yeah. No, I agree. That's a good call. I'm just going to shout out other ones to think about. There's Samurai. I think that's a timeless game, but I don't think it would necessarily qualify. High Society.
Yeah.
Argument for that, but it's certainly not as explosive and as popular as Lost Cities. And what about...
We could put Modern Art in this slot, to be honest.
Yeah.
Even though that...
What about Schotten Totten?
Ooh, maybe.
You got the Schotten Totten
that's one of the ones where it's hard for me to argue for because I've not played it, but I could believe it.
Yeah, your description of Lost Cities is very, very persuasive to me. I think it makes me think that it's either Lost Cities or Schotten Totten. They're both 2 players. They're both quite popular. And then, Schotten Totten, you've got Battle Line as like the offshoot of it. So there's sort of like even a growth within the game itself, Schotten Totten, into these other forms. Yeah, I'm gonna lean towards Schotten Totten as the game, Battle Line as the game, but I'm happy to. Okay. So we've got for Knizia, we've got his Washington game. The game is put him on the map. Is going to be Tigris and Euphrates, which has to be on there. We've got for his growth game, we've got Schotten Totten Battle Line, a game that grew within itself. We've got for his pivoting game, we've got Ingenious. Great call by Neelan for that because it shows that he could do almost like a mass market abstract game, which is very cool. And then for his game that cemented him 25 years ago, he was cemented with Ra, which makes a lot of sense given how influential he is on the hobby. Yeah, so let us know if you disagree with any of those choices for the designers. I'm sure there'll be a lot of...
I'm sure there will be people being very angry at us in the comments.
Yeah, especially with Knizia. I'd like to see what the arguments for Frieza are. Not only because I think it's going to be hard. I mean, no, you certainly can't argue your positions on Frieza, but I'd like to see what the rationale is because I'm just fascinated to see what the arguments are there. And I think with Rosenberg, again, so prolific that I think you can make arguments for other games there. And again, I would love to hear what those arguments are. You can make those arguments both to yourself and to your friends, but also if you want to get us involved, you can go to, as Neelan mentioned earlier, boardgamebarrage.com/Discord. Go to the podcast channel where we talk about that week's episode and let us know what you would put for the 3 designers Mount Rushmore. And if enough people like this kind of thing, maybe we'll revisit it with other designers as maybe a companion piece to the designer spotlights, which again, next episode will be designer spotlight. And next episode, hopefully we will have the entire group with us, or at least 3/4 of the group with us, with Kellen returning. But until next time, thank you so much for listening. Again, you can get a hold of us on Discord. You can email us at boardgamebarrage@gmail.com. You can find us on all forms of social media. Big thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next time, goodbye.
Bye-bye.